It was a normal afternoon at a small-town diner. The place buzzed with life, forks clinking on plates, the smell of fries in the air, and people laughing over lunch. The waitresses moved fast, balancing plates and coffee pots with practiced ease. A group of teens sat by the window. A mother fed her toddler nearby, and two older men played cards at the counter. Then the bell above the door jingled. Heads turned slightly as a man stepped inside. He wore a worn-out military jacket and walked with a limp, leaning on a metal cane. His face was calm, but his eyes looked tired, like they had seen too much. His boots were scuffed, and the jacket's patches were faded, almost unreadable. Without a word, he made his way to a quiet corner table and sat down slowly. He didn't ask for attention. He just wanted a meal and a little peace. At a nearby table, a group of young men in their 20s joked loudly over burgers and fries. One of them, a man with slicked back hair and an expensive-looking watch, leaned back in his seat and glanced over at the veteran. "Look at that guy," he said, loud enough for people to hear. "Probably just limping for attention." His friends chuckled, but not all of them looked comfortable. The man went on, shaking his head. "Old jacket, dirty boots. What is this? Some kind of show? I bet he wants a free meal or something. Hero discount, right?" A couple sitting nearby glanced over, but quickly looked away. A waitress behind the counter froze for a moment before forcing a smile and turning to refill a coffee cup. The air in the diner shifted. Something felt off, uneasy. But the veteran didn't respond. He sat quietly, staring out the window with his hands folded in his lap. His jaw tightened just a little, but he didn't look at the young man or say a word. The man wasn't finished. Bet he tells war stories just to feel important. What war even was he in? Anyway, Civil War, he laughed, nudging his friend. Someone near the front cleared their throat. A few diners shifted in their seats. The noise of the diner had faded, replaced by awkward silence and quiet whispers. Still, the veteran stayed calm. He didn't defend himself. He didn't yell or argue. He just sat there, his eyes tired but steady. It was clear he'd been through worse than some stranger's words. But the young man had no idea what kind of strength he was mocking, or what was about to happen next. One of the waitresses, a kind woman in her 50s named Linda, had been working there for years. She'd seen all types of people come and go, but something about this veteran reminded her of her own father, who had served in Vietnam. When she heard the young man's cruel words, her smile faded. She tried to keep working, but her hands trembled just a little as she picked up the coffee pot. She walked over to the veteran's table and gently refilled his cup. Her voice was soft, but steady. "Thank you for your service," she said, giving him a warm nod. The veteran looked up and gave her a small, tired smile. "Thank you," he replied quietly. But the peace didn't last. From across the room, the rude man scoffed. "What did he even fight for?" he said, with a smirk. "Free coffee?" A few gasps were heard. Silverware clinked against plates. Linda froze for a moment, then slowly walked away, holding back tears. Tension filled the room like thick smoke. The laughter from earlier was gone. All eyes began to turn toward the veteran's table. Something was building, and no one knew what would happen next. As the rude man's words hung in the air, more people in the diner began to notice. The chatter and laughter from before had all but stopped. Eyes shifted toward the table where the young man sat, still smirking. At a table near the window, a mother quickly leaned over and covered her child's ears. The little girl who had been asking about the veteran looked confused. Across the room, an older man with gray hair and a thick mustache narrowed his eyes at the loudmouth. His grip tightened around his coffee cup, but he didn't speak up. He only glared, the tension clear in his furrowed brow. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some glanced at the veteran, then quickly looked away. No one knew what to do. The young man continued to laugh, unaware that the whole room had turned against him. Finally, the veteran shifted in his seat, a quiet groan escaping his lips. Slowly he stood up, leaning on his cane for support. Every movement was slow, each step clearly painful, but he didn't pause, didn't hesitate. His limp echoed through the diner, drawing all attention to him. The chatter stopped completely. The veteran, despite the pain in his leg, made his way toward the cashier, each step heavy and deliberate. The silence in the room deepened. No one moved. It was as if time had stopped. The veteran reached the counter and paused, his back still to the crowd. He stood there for a long moment, taking in the silence, before turning slowly, his eyes fixed on the young man, and the room seemed to hold its breath. "You don't know me," the veteran said quietly, his voice surprisingly steady. The words hung in the air. The rude man blinked, unsure of how to respond. The laughter that had once filled his face faded. The veteran took a deep breath, and continued, his eyes distant but clear. "I didn't fight for free coffee or your respect," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of years of pain. "I fought because there were people depending on me. I lost my leg saving people I'll never see again, people I never got to say goodbye to." The young man's expression wavered, but he said nothing. The veteran's eyes swept across the room, meeting the gazes of the people who had been watching. "I'm not angry," he said, his voice catching slightly. "I'm just sad that respect for each other has become so rare. We're all just trying to make it through the day." For a moment the room was still. Some people blinked away tears, others looked down at their hands or at their plates. The veteran didn't raise his voice, didn't shout, but somehow, his words filled the room, and the weight of them seemed to settle over everyone present. The young man, for the first time, looked away, his face flushed, his mouth open but silent. The room was still, the tension thick in the air. The young man didn't speak, but his face had changed. There was a flicker of discomfort, something unfamiliar. The veteran's words had struck him in a way he hadn't expected. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, suddenly unsure of himself. But it wasn't just the veteran's words that caused the shift. As the man sat there, his eyes darting around the room, Linda, the waitress, stood by the counter, watching him closely. She had been silent until now, but something in her gaze seemed to change. Her mind raced. She had seen that face before. "You went to high school with my son," she said, her voice calm but firm. The room went quiet as all eyes turned to her. The young man's head snapped toward her. He didn't respond at first. Then his mouth opened, but no words came out. Linda took a step closer, her voice soft but full of quiet authority. "Your father was a Marine, wasn't he?" she asked. "He fought for this country. He gave everything. Would he be proud of you right now?" The young man froze, his face draining of color. His lips parted, but the cocky grin that had been there earlier was now gone. His eyes dropped to the table, and his shoulders slumped slightly, as if the weight of the question had hit him all at once. Murmurs rippled through the diner. People began to shift in their seats, some exchanging looks of disbelief. The tough, confident man who had been mocking the veteran seemed smaller now. His bravado crumbled, piece by piece. The veteran stood there for a long moment, staring at the young man who still hadn't moved. The room was heavy with silence. People exchanged glances, some feeling sympathy for the young man, some feeling awe for the veteran. But then the unexpected happened. The veteran reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his worn wallet. He opened it slowly, his fingers trembling slightly as he removed a few crumpled bills. His movements were deliberate, almost peaceful, despite the tension still hanging in the air. He walked up to the cashier without saying another word. The young man watched, confused, as the veteran placed the money on the counter. "I'll take care of his meal," the veteran said quietly, his voice calm, yet filled with a quiet strength that seemed to resonate in the room. The cashier stared at him, wide-eyed, unsure of what to say. She took the money, nodding quickly, still processing what was happening. The young man blinked, his mind racing. No, you don't have to," he started, his voice cracking, but the veteran held up a hand to stop him. "Someone once saved me when I didn't deserve it," the veteran said, his words deliberate, each one heavy with meaning. "I guess it's my turn now." The diner went silent, the gasps of surprise filling the air as people watched the scene unfold. Some were in disbelief, while others felt the weight of the veteran's words. As the veteran turned to leave, a few claps began, tentative at first, then building as more people joined in. The rude man looked utterly overwhelmed, his mouth hanging open, unable to respond. He stood up, as if to stop the veteran, but he didn't know how to. He just watched, stunned. The veteran nodded once, a small gesture of finality, and then turned toward the door. His limp was still there, but his steps were steady. He walked out, leaving behind a room full of people who would never forget what they had just witnessed. The young man sat in his seat, his face pale, and his hands trembling slightly. The clattering of plates and silverware had faded into the background. His thoughts seemed to be spinning, his mind replaying everything. The veteran's calm words, the unexpected act of kindness. For the first time that day, he didn't know what to say or do. He had been so sure of himself before, so certain of his own superiority. But now, the laughter, the mocking, it all felt hollow. He had crossed a line he couldn't erase. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he stood up. His movements were slow, unsure, and his eyes never left the door where the veteran had left. He walked outside and paused, looking down the street. Through the quiet, he spotted the veteran getting into a worn-down truck, the engine starting with a slow rumble. The truck was old, but it seemed to carry a sense of dignity that he hadn't noticed before. The young man's chest tightened. A week had passed since that unforgettable moment in the diner, and when the young man returned, it was clear that something within him had changed. The brashness that once defined him was now absent. His face was clean-shaven, the sharp edges of his features softened by the new calmness in his demeanor. His clothes were neat, pressed even, and his posture no longer arrogant, was more humble, as if he was carrying a quiet weight that only he could understand. He entered the diner with no swagger, no loud words, no gestures to draw attention. His footsteps were softer, more measured. He moved through the room quietly, almost blending in, as if he were unsure of where he belonged anymore. People glanced at him, but he didn't meet their eyes. He walked past the familiar tables, toward the veteran's usual seat. With careful hands, the young man reached for the small bouquet of flowers, their delicate petals soft and vibrant in contrast to the hardened figure he had once presented to the world. The flowers, a simple gesture, felt like an offering, an attempt to make up for the hurt he had caused. Each petal seemed to whisper a quiet apology, the colors a reflection of the change he was trying to embrace. It was a stark contrast to the brash, loud man who had once strutted into the diner, demanding attention, quick to mock, slow to understand. Beside the flowers, he placed a folded note, its edges slightly creased, as though it had been written, then rewritten, in his mind over and over again. Each word felt carefully chosen, the weight of them heavy in his hands. The note itself was simple, yet its simplicity made it all the more powerful. It didn't need to be long or dramatic. It didn't need to make excuses. It was just a quiet, honest statement from a man who had finally found his own humility. The note simply read, "I'm sorry. Thank you for your service." As he stepped back, his eyes lingered on the note for a moment longer, as if he needed to make sure those words were enough. It was a small thing, a small change, but in his heart, it felt like the first step towards something much bigger. The words were simple, nothing more than a few lines on a small piece of paper, but they carried a weight that seemed to hang in the air, heavy and undeniable. As the note lay beside the flowers, it wasn't just a written apology, it was a reflection of change, a quiet admission of guilt, and a desire to make things right. No one in the room could ignore it. The simplicity of the words only made them more powerful, as if in those few short sentences, the young man had managed to express everything that had been swirling inside him since that fateful day. The diner seemed to hold its breath, the usual noise fading, as the significance of that moment settled in, leaving everyone with a sense of quiet understanding. Sometimes it doesn't take grand gestures to make a difference. It only takes the courage to acknowledge the truth. As the young man turned to leave, Linda, the waitress, watched him from behind the counter, her hands paused mid-motion. The diner was bustling, but her attention was fixed solely on him. She had seen him before, his loud, obnoxious voice, his cocky, dismissive attitude that seemed to fill the room with a tense energy. He had been nothing but disrespectful, a young man who thought the world owed him something, and he wasn't afraid to show it. But now, as she watched him stand there, his posture different, his face softer, she saw something else. He was no longer the brash, arrogant young man who had mocked the veteran. Instead, there was a quiet humility in his movements, something fragile in the way he held himself. It was almost as if he had taken a long, hard look at his past actions, and realized they weren't the man he wanted to be. There was a weight in his step now, not of arrogance, but of quiet reflection. Linda noticed the flowers, and the simple note beside them. She had seen plenty of apologies in her time, but this felt different. It wasn't loud or grandiose. It was sincere, a small act of kindness, a step toward redemption. She couldn't help but smile softly as she saw him leave, the room suddenly feeling a little brighter. Her heart felt lighter than it had in a long time. Maybe it was the softness in his eyes, or the genuine way he had acted. No words, no excuses, just a quiet acknowledgement of what had transpired. She whispered to herself, maybe people can change after all. Her voice was filled with a mix of relief and quiet hope, as if for a moment she could believe that there was still goodness in the world, that even the hardest hearts could soften with time. As the diner slowly returned to its usual rhythm, something profound had shifted in the air. The chatter, the clinking of silverware, the hum of conversation, it all seemed a little quieter now. The simple act of kindness, the one moment of quiet strength from the veteran, had left a lasting impression on everyone who witnessed it. What had started as a typical lunch hour had turned into a lesson in humanity, one that no one would soon forget. The veteran's decision to respond with grace, to not give in to anger or revenge, spoke louder than any words. It wasn't just about silencing the mocking voice across the room. It was about showing something far more powerful, something that had been missing in that moment. Respect. His calm, his ability to rise above hatred, had done what shouting or fighting never could. It had opened eyes, softened hearts, and reminded everyone present that true strength doesn't lie in putting others down. It's found in choosing compassion, even when it's undeserved. He didn't shout. He didn't demand an apology. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply showed the world what true honor looks like by acting in a way most people would never expect. The veteran had nothing to prove to anyone, and yet he left behind a lesson that spoke volumes. In doing so, he didn't just change the heart of the rude man. He reminded every single person in that diner what it truly means to be kind, to show respect, and to look beyond the surface to understand someone's worth. Sometimes it only takes one person, one moment, to remind us all of the good in the world, and to restore faith in humanity. And in that moment, when the room fell silent and the tension faded, everyone in that diner witnessed the true power of grace. Thank you for watching this powerful story. It's a reminder that kindness and respect have the power to change hearts and make the world a better place. We hope this story left an impression on you just as it did on everyone in the diner. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and share it with your friends. Your support means so much to us. And if you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe to stay updated with more emotional and inspiring stories. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to leave a comment below. Until next time, remember, sometimes it only takes one act of kindness to change everything.